I'd like to dedicate my contribution to this debate tonight to the memory of Dr. Al Lewis, scholar, activist, artist, and humanist. Most of you know him as Grandpa Al, but Grandpa Al's life demonstrated all tough Brooklyn Jews didn't become gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, or athletes like the great fighter Bonnie Ross, or political reactionaries like Norman Podhoretz. Some chose the path of progressive struggle taken by such great radical intellectual activists as Sidney Kaplan, Herbert Aptheker, and Jack Newfield, men from whom I learned much. Thus, I believe that I speak for that tribe of oppositional voices who follow Grandpa's example when I say that now, like when Tolstoy died, we are all orphans. When I was originally asked, the theme of my polemic is the Iraq War is criminal folly. Now, when I say folly, I'm basing this on the concept of folly as presented in the book The March of Folly by Barbara Tuchman, the two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, which means that when a great nation pursues a policy which is demonstrably not in its best interest. The Iraq War is criminal folly. When I was originally approached about debating the wisdom and justice of the war in Iraq, I was hesitant, because I thought anybody who at this late stage of the game was willing to defend such a criminal war, which by some respectable estimates has slaughtered up to 200,000 innocent Iraqi civilians while reducing their country to ruin, and caused the death of over 2,200 young American men and women while leaving more than 50,000 mentally and physically impaired for life, squandering hundreds of billions of dollars of the nation's treasure, 440 billion thus far. And Professor Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist at Columbia, says this could cost $2 trillion before it's all over. I surmise that in either case, that such a person would either be a charlatan, a fool, or a narrow-minded fanatic. And I surmise that in either case, I would be placing myself in an untenable situation, because a charlatan will say anything to win an argument. And my grandfather long ago warned me to never argue with a fool, because the people looking on can't tell who's who. However, to my joy and delight, the opponent they had in mind has turned out to be far from a fool, and he shall soon reveal if he's an unthinking fanatic. And I shall leave it to the audience to decide if he's a charlatan. On that question, your guess is as good as mine. He seems like a nice guy. What is not in question, however, is that Mr. Hitchens is an intellectual of international stature, a cosmopolite and bon vivant, a man who has been declared one of the finest minds of our time, an Oxford man and celebrated scribe, an heir to the tradition of Chaucer and Shakespeare, a child of empire who embodies the highest cultural achievement of that sceptred isle with the unmitigated audacity to call itself Great Britain. And thus tonight, he presents us with a living paradox, a walking oxymoron, a learned man on a fool's errand. And as befits his mission, Mr. Hitchens has chosen to make his stand on sinking intellectual sands. In any case, it is a propitious moment for this debate, because it is the beginning of African American History Month, a time when the world is viewed through the eyes of black folk, a counter-vision of reality that makes some white folk nervous and terrorizes others, because it calls into question the moral conceits of modern European civilization and the myth of American exceptionalism on such questions as freedom, justice, and equality. Like the great African American historian Dr. Benjamin Quarles, author of the seminal study, The Negro and the American Revolution, I believe that those who wish to understand the full complexity of contemporary events need to add a dimension of historical perspective. The source of my unique take on events was explained by Dr. W.B. Du Bois, the most broadly learned, prophetic, and consequential American humanist intellectual of the 20th century, who observed in his 1903 masterpiece, The Souls of Black Folk, the Negro is the seventh son of a seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with a second sight in this American world. I will analyze the war tonight from that second sight. Furthermore, Dr. Du Bois had already conceptualized the general problem posed by Iraq in an earlier speech given at the first Pan-African Congress held in London during 1900. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, he declared. The question as to how far differences of race are going to be made hereafter, the basis of denying to over half the world the right to sharing to their utmost ability the opportunities and privileges of modern civilization. And in the case, the world must needs remember that in this age when the ends of the world are being brought so near together, The millions of black men in Africa, America, and the islands of the sea, not to speak of the brown and yellow myriads elsewhere, are bound to have great influence upon the world in the future by reason of sheer numbers and physical contact. After pointing out that if the all-powerful Europeans promoted the peaceful development of the colored nations, it would redound to the good of the world community, Dr. Du Bois goes on to observe, but if by reason of carelessness, prejudice, greed, and injustice, the black world is to be exploited and ravished and degraded, the results must be deplorable, if not fatal, not simply to them, but to the high ideals of justice, freedom, and culture which 1,000 years of Christian civilization have held before Europe. This was a prophetic statement indeed, because the Islamic jihadists today are best understood as a response to the myriad European sins that Dr. Du Bois warned against a century ago. In political terms, Iraq represents a failed British neo-colonial experiment with a Bush administration high on hubris has tried to salvage by remaking it to an American recipe, just as the disaster in Vietnam 40 years ago represents a U.S. attempt to save a failed French colonial project. And while there are many differences between these two conflicts, they have much in common, the most obvious of which is that they were directed by misguided macho Texas cowboys. It is into the motion of a bloodstained history of Western imperialism, with its maze-like twists and turns and cul-de-sacs, which the Bushmen and their apologists have wandered without a functional compass. And it is abundantly clear that Murphy's Law is in full effect here. Everything that can go wrong has gone wrong and will go wrong in this war born of high crimes and misdemeanors. Thus, I shall summarize my opposition to the war of aggression in 9 points, which will form the basis of my argument tonight. I oppose the war because I cannot believe that an event First of all, I oppose the war because it is a violation of international law and the most grievous instance of a tendency on the part of the Bush administration to trash the machinery of international order and cooperation. That includes unsigning the International Criminal Court Treaty, which looks like a prescient move in retrospect since he would now be facing indictment, scrapping the Kyoto Agreement on saving environment, and moving to unilaterally abrogate the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the greatest diplomatic achievement of the nuclear age. Taken together, these policies have made the world a more dangerous and unstable place because they threaten the existence of all life on this planet. Furthermore, I oppose the war because I cannot believe that an event conceived with evil intent can produce a righteous income. I oppose the war because the invasion of Iraq is hindering the war on terror. It is recruiting far more terrorists than the American military is killing or can kill. Thus, it is promoting, not stopping, the wider war on terror. I oppose the war because democratic government cannot be exploited by armed invaders. And I abhor the willingness to kill or cause the deaths of tens of thousands of innocent Iraqi civilians and dismiss the slaughter of innocents with the soulless term collateral damage, which I first heard when the Iraqi war veteran Timothy McVeigh used it to justify blowing up a building with child care day centers and just to get at his real targets in the federal government. I believe this policy is as much a capital crime when committed in Iraq as in Oklahoma. And to argue otherwise is has that grinning charlatan John McCain who talks out of both sides of his mouth and that shameless hussy Condoleezza Rice, the wicked witch of the West, is to promote racism and chauvinism of the sort that the Nazis promoted. I oppose the war in Iraq because it's not only morally bankrupt as foreign policy, but incompetent in strategy. I oppose the war in Iraq because it is being fought on the backs of the poor. George II, errand boy of the plutocrats, has asked no sacrifice from the running partners who own the nation's wealth. In fact, braggadocious buffoon that he is, he can be seen in Michael Moore's brilliant documentary Fahrenheit 9/11, which my man here don't like, bragging about being one of the haves and have-mores, and he tells them in any extraordinary display of hubris, some people call you elite, I call you my base. So I'm going thus I finally oppose the war because I cannot fathom how an administration that has been given a failing grade on preparedness on the home front by the 9/11 Commission can ensure the security of Iraq, especially now that they have admittedly converted into the front lines in the battle against the Islamic jihadists. Like the old blues man said, the whole world is in trouble and the danger zone is everywhere as a result of their policies. So I will finally end with this. Addressing an assemblage of white Americans, Frederick Douglass, the incredibly eloquent and learned abolitionist, essayist, ex-slave, on the 4th of July in 1841, to a completely white audience, he said this, and of course I'm going to repeat it now because I believe that if you put this question to the Islamic jihadists or all the people in the Islamic world who consider themselves to be opposing American imperialism, I think that this would be their response. If you were to ask them the question, what does America's self-designation as the citadel of freedom and democracy mean to you? They would reply, like Frederick Douglass, who was speaking on behalf of African-American slaves, to him your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity, your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciation of tyrants brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality hollow mockery, your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgiving, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy's thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace the nation of savages. There's not a nation of the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour, end of quote. And I think that's an excellent description of American policy in Iraq tonight.